For fun, a millionaire invited a waitress and her son to his birthday party. On the day of the party, the waitress sat down at the piano and the guests were paralyzed. The grand concert hall fell silent as the first notes of Song of the Soul filled the air. On stage, a woman in a modest black dress sat at the gleaming concert piano, her fingers dancing across the keys with both precision and passion. Beside her, a small boy of about 8 stood, his clear voice rising pure and strong, touching every heart in the packed audience. Sarah Matthews closed her eyes, letting the music flow through her, each note carrying the weight of her struggles and dreams. In the front row, William Harrison watched, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. This wasn't supposed to happen, not like this, not here at his annual charity gala. The performance reached its crescendo, and Tommy's voice soared higher, filling the magnificent space with angelic clarity. But as the final verse approached, something changed. Tommy's voice faltered slightly, barely noticeable to most, but to Sarah it was like a thunderclap. Her eyes snapped open, catching her son's reflection in the polished surface of the piano. Tommy's face had gone ghostly pale. "Mum," he whispered, his voice trembling, no longer singing. The microphone caught the word, sending it echoing through the silent hall. "I can't." Before Sarah could react, Tommy's knees buckled. She lunged from the piano bench, barely catching him before he hit the stage floor. The music stopped abruptly, the final notes hanging unfinished in the air. "Someone call an ambulance," Sarah's cry pierced the stunned silence. "Please, my son needs help." The chaos that erupted was immediate. Will Harrison rose from his seat, his face drained of color as memories of another medical emergency, his wife Emily's final moments, flashed through his mind. In the wings, Michael Anderson, the famous music producer, was already on his phone, barking urgent instructions. As paramedics rushed onto the stage, Sarah cradled Tommy in her arms, whispering prayers and promises. The audience watched in shocked silence as the boy was lifted onto a stretcher, his small hand clutching his mother's desperately. He stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. In Tommy's desperate grip on his mother's hand, he saw a reflection of Emily's final moments, and something inside him cracked. This wasn't just another charity case or a publicity stunt anymore. This was a mother's love, raw and real, playing out before him, and he had played a part in bringing them to this moment. The sound of ambulance sirens pierced the night, marking the beginning of a story that would change all their lives forever. If this story has touched your heart, let your emotions guide your hand to the subscribe button. Join our community of storytellers and dreamers, where each tale we share is crafted to move souls and inspire hearts. Your support keeps the magic alive. Sarah Matthews wasn't always a waitress serving drinks in dimly lit bars. Just 5 years ago, she graced prestigious concert halls, her name appearing in bold letters on classical music programs across the country. A child prodigy who became a celebrated pianist, Sarah had been destined for greatness until fate dealt her a cruel hand. Born into a musical family, Sarah's talent emerged early. Her mother, Grace Matthews, a respected piano teacher at the local conservatory, recognized the gift in her daughter's small hands when Sarah, at age 4, perfectly replicated a complex melody she had heard only once. Under Grace's nurturing guidance, Sarah blossomed, winning competition after competition, her future in music seemingly assured. By 16, Sarah had performed at Carnegie Hall. At 20, she was touring Europe, her interpretations of classical masterpieces earning standing ovations in Vienna, Paris, and London. Critics praised her soul-stirring depth and technical brilliance that never sacrifices emotional truth. The world of classical music had found its new star, and Sarah Matthews shone brightly. Everything changed when her parents' investment firm collapsed during the financial crisis. The scandal that followed revealed devastating fraud not by her parents, but by their trusted partner. The Matthews family lost everything: their home, their savings, and their reputation. Grace, already battling cancer, couldn't survive the shock. She passed away just 3 months later, leaving Sarah to care for her father, whose health rapidly declined under the weight of depression and shame. Sarah cancelled her tours and sold her prized Steinway to pay for her father's medical bills. She took any job she could find, eventually settling into waitressing at the Blue Note, a modest bar where the manager, kind-hearted Bob Wilson, understood her need for flexible hours to care for her father. Then came Tommy. She found him one rainy night outside the hospital where her father was staying, a tiny figure huddled in the doorway of the children's ward. His birth mother, a young woman with terminal cancer, had left him there, unable to care for him any longer. Something in his eyes, filled with both fear and determination, spoke to Sarah's soul. Despite her circumstances, or perhaps because of them, she knew she had to help. The adoption process was complicated, given her financial situation, but Sarah fought with everything she had. She worked double shifts, sold her remaining valuables, and somehow made it work. Tommy, who showed an immediate affinity for music, became her reason to keep going, to keep believing in the power of love and determination. During the day, Sarah served drinks and endured the occasional condescending comment from wealthy patrons who had no idea they were being served by someone who once commanded $1,000 tickets. At night, she taught Tommy music on their second-hand upright piano, its slightly out-of-tune keys still capable of producing magic under their shared passion. Their tiny apartment above the laundromat became a sanctuary of music and love. Sarah discovered that teaching Tommy brought back the joy of music she thought she had lost. His natural talent reminded her of herself at his age, and his enthusiasm for learning rekindled her own passion for the art. But life had more challenges in store. Tommy's mysterious health issues began to surface, requiring frequent hospital visits that strained their already tight budget. Sarah kept their struggles private, maintaining a brave face for her son, while silently carrying the weight of mounting medical bills and dwindling resources. Yet through it all, Sarah never lost her grace or her belief in the transformative power of music. She continued to play whenever she could, her fingers finding their way to any available piano, whether it was the battered upright in the bar's corner or the display model at the local music store. Her playing changed, though. Where once it had been about technical perfection and artistic interpretation, now it carried the depth of lived experience, of love and loss, struggle and hope. This was Sarah Matthews, former concert pianist, devoted mother, survivor. She wore her waitress uniform with the same dignity she once wore evening gowns on stage, finding beauty in service and strength in sacrifice. Little did she know that fate wasn't finished with her story, that a chance encounter at a wealthy man's birthday party would set in motion events that would challenge everything she had built and believed in. William Will Harrison stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, a glass of scotch in hand, staring at the city below. To the world, he was the epitome of success, CEO of Harrison Enterprises, philanthropist, and one of the city's most eligible widowers. But behind the carefully crafted facade lay a man haunted by loss and consumed by grief. 5 years ago, Will had everything. His company was thriving, his marriage to Emily was the stuff of society-page dreams, and their love story seemed destined for a fairy tale ending. Emily, with her gentle spirit and passionate dedication to music education, had transformed Will from a ruthless businessman into someone who understood the value of giving back. Their love story began at a charity concert where Emily, then a music teacher at an inner-city school, was performing to raise funds for her students. Will, attending out of obligation rather than interest, found himself captivated not just by her beauty, but by her fierce dedication to bringing music to underprivileged children. Her passion awakened something in him he didn't know existed. Emily taught Will to appreciate the finer things in life beyond material wealth. Under her influence, the Harrison mansion filled with music. She converted one of the grand rooms into a music studio where she gave free lessons to talented children who couldn't afford them. Will would often find her there, surrounded by young musicians, her face glowing with joy as she nurtured their talents. Their happiness seemed complete when Emily announced her pregnancy. They spent months planning the nursery, choosing names and dreaming of their future family. But fate had other plans. In her 7th month, Emily developed complications. Despite the best medical care money could buy, both she and their unborn daughter were lost within a matter of days. The last words Emily spoke to Will haunt him. Still, promise me you'll keep the music playing, my love. Promise me you'll help those who need it most. But in his grief, Will did exactly the opposite. He locked the music room, cancelled all charity concerts, and threw himself into work with a vengeance that shocked even his hardest driving executives. Now at 45, Will Harrison was twice as wealthy as he'd been when Emily died, and completely hollow inside. His annual birthday galas, once joyous celebrations of music and charity under Emily's influence, had become cold corporate affairs where the wealthy patted themselves on the back for token donations while drinking $1,000 champagne. The mansion's staff whispered about how he would sometimes stand outside the locked music room late at night, especially after drinking, his hand on the doorknob, never quite able to turn it. The piano inside, Emily's pride and joy, sat untouched, gathering dust beneath its cover. The only time the house saw any life was during his lavish parties, where Will played the role of gracious host while keeping everyone at arm's length. His closest friend, Michael Anderson, the music producer, tried repeatedly to break through Will's shell of isolation. "Emily wouldn't want this for you," Michael would say. "She'd want you to live, to love again, to keep her mission alive." But Will remained unmoved, building higher walls around his heart with each passing year. The change in Will was most evident in his business dealings, where once he had tempered his aggressive business tactics with Emily's compassionate influence, now he became known as the corporate executioner acquiring struggling companies just to dismantle them for profit. He told himself he was being practical, efficient, but deep down, he knew he was punishing the world for taking Emily from him. His annual birthday gala was approaching again, and this year something felt different. Perhaps it was the way the light hit Emily's portrait in his study that morning, or maybe it was the street musician playing song of the soul, Emily's favorite piece, outside his office building. Whatever the reason, Will felt an unfamiliar stirring in his soul, a whisper of the man he used to be. Little did he know that his decision to invite a waitress and her son to his party, a gesture made with cynical amusement, would set in motion events that would force him to confront not just his past, but the promises he'd made and broken. The music he'd silenced was about to play again, whether he was ready or not. At just 8 years old, Tommy Matthews carried both a remarkable gift and a heavy burden. His small frame housed an extraordinary musical talent that seemed to defy his years, but also harbored a mysterious illness that threatened to steal his dreams before they could fully take flight. Tommy's earliest memories weren't of a biological family, but of hospital corridors and the gentle voice of a woman singing to him through his pain. Sarah Matthews hadn't given birth to him, but from the moment she found him in that hospital doorway, their souls recognized each other. The adoption process was a blur of paperwork and interviews, but somehow, against all odds, they became a family. From the first day in their tiny apartment, Tommy was drawn to the old upright piano like a moth to flame. Even before he could reach the pedals, he would sit for hours, picking out melodies he'd heard on the radio or in the grocery store. Sarah noticed how his small fingers seemed to dance across the keys with an innate understanding that went beyond his years. Despite their financial struggles, Tommy never complained about their circumstances. He wore second-hand clothes with pride, made friends with the stray cats in the alley behind their building, and found joy in the simplest things, especially music. When Sarah taught him song of the soul, the piece seemed to awaken something deep within him, as if the music had always been there, waiting to be discovered. But life had dealt Tommy a challenging hand. The mysterious fatigue and occasional dizzy spells began shortly after his 7th birthday. At first, Sarah dismissed them as growth spurts or perhaps the excitement of starting school. But when he collapsed during a school choir performance, they couldn't ignore it anymore. The doctor's visits began, each one adding new worries and mounting bills. Through it all, Tommy remained remarkably resilient. He turned hospital stays into adventures, entertaining other young patients with his singing. The nurses called him their little maestro, sneaking him into the hospital chapel late at night so he could play the small piano there. Even when the tests and treatments left him exhausted, he never lost his smile or his passion for music. At school, Tommy was both admired and isolated. His classmates were drawn to his friendly nature and musical abilities, but the frequent absences and his inability to participate in sports created a subtle barrier. Some parents warned their children away, whispering about his mysterious illness and his adoption status. But Tommy faced it all with a quiet dignity that seemed far beyond his years. His relationship with Sarah was something special to behold. They weren't just mother and son, they were kindred spirits connected by music. Their evening practice sessions were sacred, filled with laughter and love even when Tommy's fingers stumbled from fatigue. He would often tell Sarah, "When I grow up, I want to play just like you, Mom." Those words both filled her heart and broke it, knowing the uncertainty that lay ahead. Tommy had a secret dream that he kept tucked away in his heart. He'd seen videos of young prodigies performing with orchestras, their music touching thousands of lives. Late at night, when the pain kept him awake, he would imagine himself on those stages, playing not for fame or glory, but to make his mom proud, to help her smile the way she did in the old concert photos he'd found hidden in her drawer. The other children at school had no idea that the quiet boy who sat at the back of the class, sometimes too tired to participate in games, spent his nights practicing until his mother gently insisted he rest. They didn't know that when he missed school, it wasn't always because he was sick. Sometimes it was because Sarah couldn't afford both his medications and the bus fare that week. But Tommy's spirit remained unbroken. He had inherited not just his mother's musical talent, but her determination and grace in the face of adversity. When other kids bragged about their new toys or family vacations, Tommy would simply smile, knowing that the music he and his mom shared was worth more than all the material possessions in the world. Now, as he prepared for the biggest performance of his young life, Tommy carried a weight that no child should have to bear. He knew about the mounting medical bills, had seen his mother crying over them late at night when she thought he was asleep. This performance had to be perfect, not for himself, but for her, for all she had sacrificed for him. Little did Tommy know that his upcoming performance would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything he knew about family strength and the power of music to heal even the deepest wounds. The Blue Note bar was unusually crowded that night, filled with the Friday evening rush of businessmen loosening their ties and forgetting their week's troubles in glasses of expensive scotch. Sarah moved efficiently between tables, her practiced smile never wavering despite the exhaustion seeping into her bones from a double shift. Will Harrison sat in the corner booth, watching her with calculated interest. He'd recognized her immediately, the waitress from his wedding 3 years ago who had played the piano so beautifully. Now here she was, serving drinks in this modest establishment, her once elegant hands carrying trays of beer and bar snacks. The irony amused him in his alcohol-induced contemplation. Another whiskey, so Sarah approached his table, maintaining her professional demeanor despite recognizing the wealthy man whose wedding she'd once worked. The wedding where she dared to play Emily's piano, where for a brief moment she'd remembered who she used to be. Will studied her name tag with exaggerated interest. "Sarah, tell me, do you still play the piano? I seem to remember quite a performance at my wedding." His voice carried a hint of mockery that made Sarah's spine stiffen, though her smile remained fixed in place. "When I have the opportunity, sir," she replied diplomatically, avoiding his gaze as she cleared empty glasses from his table. The words "when I have the opportunity" hung heavy in the air, laden with unspoken realities about privilege and circumstance. "And that boy of yours? Tommy, isn't it?" I hear he has quite the voice. Will's words stopped her in her tracks. The fact that he knew her son's name sent a chill down her spine. She turned to face him fully for the first time that evening. "You've heard about Tommy?" she asked carefully, her protective instincts rising. Will smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Word gets around in certain circles. A prodigy working-class boy with a mysterious illness. It's quite the touching story. He took another sip of his whiskey, watching her reaction over the rim of his glass. "My son's health is not a topic for bar conversation, Mr. Harrison," Sarah replied, her voice quiet but firm. She turned to leave, but his next words froze her in place. "I'm having my annual birthday gala next Saturday," he announced, pulling an elegant invitation from his jacket pocket. "Very exclusive. The city's finest will be there. I'd like you and Tommy to attend." He held out the invitation like a king bestowing a favor on a peasant. Sarah stared at the cream-colored envelope, her mind racing. This was the type of opportunity Tommy dreamed of, a chance to be heard by people who could actually make a difference in their lives. But something in Will's tone, in the calculating look in his eyes, made her hesitate. "Why?" she asked simply, not reaching for the invitation. Will's smile widened slightly. "Let's call it curiosity. I want to see how you and your boy handle yourselves in more refined company. Consider it an experiment in social mobility." The cruel undertone in his voice was unmistakable now. Sarah should have walked away. Every instinct told her this was a trap, a wealthy man's amusement at the expense of her dignity. But then she thought of the hospital bills piling up at home, of Tommy's dream to perform for a real audience, of the medications they couldn't afford. With steady hands, she took the invitation. "What time should we arrive?" 7 sharp. "Oh," and Will's voice stopped her again. "Do try to dress appropriately. We wouldn't want you to feel out of place." As Sarah walked away, Will watched her retreating figure with satisfaction. This would be entertaining a waitress and her sick child trying to navigate his world of wealth and privilege. Little did he know that his cruel invitation would set in motion events that would shake his carefully constructed world to its foundations. That night, after her shift ended, Sarah sat on the edge of Tommy's bed, watching him sleep. The invitation felt heavy in her pocket, like a weight pulling her toward an uncertain future. "What am I getting us into, baby?" she whispered, brushing his hair back from his forehead. The answer would come sooner than she expected, and it would change everything. The week leading up to Will Harrison's gala became a brutal test of Sarah's endurance. Each day was a carefully orchestrated ballet of work shifts, hospital visits, and desperate attempts to prepare for the upcoming event. The invitation sat on their kitchen counter, its gold lettering seeming to mock their threadbare circumstances. Monday began with another hospital visit. Dr. Anderson, a kind-faced woman who had been treating Tommy for months, delivered the news Sarah had been dreading. "The tests show his condition is progressing faster than we anticipated," she explained gently. "We need to start the new treatment protocol immediately." The words expensive and experimental hung unspoken between them. Sarah clutched Tommy's hand tighter as Dr. Anderson outlined the costs. The numbers made her head spin. More money than she could hope to earn in years of double shifts. Tommy, sensing her distress, squeezed her hand back. "It's okay," Mommy whispered. "We don't need it." His selflessness only made her heart ache more. That evening, Sarah stood in front of their building's coin-operated washing machine, counting out quarters for Tommy's best shirt, his only dress shirt, really. The fabric was worn thin at the collar, but it was all they had for the gala. As the machine hummed, Sarah closed her eyes, remembering the designer gowns she used to wear for her concerts. Now she was planning to wear her waitress uniform's black dress, the only formal attire she owned. Wednesday brought another crisis. Tommy collapsed during choir practice at school. Sarah rushed from work, still in her uniform, to find him pale but conscious in the nurse's office. "I just got dizzy, Mom," he insisted, but his hands trembled as he reached for her. The school nurse gave Sarah a concerned look. He should be resting, not preparing for performances, she advised quietly. But Tommy wouldn't hear of cancelling their appearance at the gala. "This is our chance," Mom he said that night as she tucked him into bed. "Maybe if enough important people hear us play, we can get help for the treatments." His optimism broke something inside her. No child should have to think about performing to pay for their medical care. Thursday night, after her shift, Sarah snuck into the Blue Note's back room where the old piano stood. Her fingers found the keys in the darkness, practicing Psalm of the Soul until they ached. The melody seemed to carry all her fears and hopes: fear of humiliation at the gala, hope for Tommy's recovery, and the desperate prayer that somehow this performance could change their lives. Bob, the bar owner, found her there in the early hours of Friday morning. Without a word, he placed a small envelope on the piano. Inside was $300, not much by the standards of Will Harrison's world, but a fortune to them. "For a proper dress," Bob said gruffly. "Can't have my best waitress showing up underdressed." Sarah tried to refuse, but Bob wouldn't hear of it. The dress she found at the second-hand store was navy blue, slightly outdated but elegant enough. The saleswoman, touched by Sarah's story, threw in a matching tie for Tommy at no extra cost. Sometimes angels wear thrift store aprons, Sarah thought, fighting back tears of gratitude. Saturday morning found Sarah at the hospital again, this time for Tommy's pre-treatment evaluation. The nurse taking his blood pressure frowned at the results. "His numbers are concerning," she said. "He really should be resting tonight." But when she saw the look exchange between mother and son, she sighed and added, "Just promise me you'll both take it easy after the performance." As they left the hospital, Sarah noticed Tommy trying to hide his limp, pushing through the fatigue that seemed to weigh heavier on him each day. She knelt down in front of him in the parking lot, straightening his second-hand tie. "We don't have to do this, baby," she whispered. "We can go home, rest, find another way." Tommy's response was to hug her fiercely. "Mom, remember what you always tell me? Music isn't just what we do, it's who we are. Tonight we show them who we are." His words, so wise beyond his years, gave her strength. As they prepared to leave for the gala, Sarah caught their reflection in the cracked mirror of their tiny bathroom. Despite everything, they looked dignified, a mother and son united by love, music, and determination. What they lacked in designer labels, they made up for in grace. Looking at Tommy's brave smile in the mirror, Sarah made a silent vow. Whatever happened at Will Harrison's gala, she would protect her son's spirit. They might be going into the lion's den, but they would face it together, with their heads held high and music in their hearts. The Harrison mansion loomed before them, its windows blazing with light that spilled onto the manicured lawns. Sarah and Tommy stood at the iron gates, their second-hand formal wear suddenly feeling painfully inadequate as luxury cars glided past them, depositing guests in designer evening wear and glittering jewels. "Your invitation, madam." The security guard's skeptical glance at their attire made Sarah's cheeks burn as she presented the cream-colored envelope. His eyebrows rose slightly, but he waved them through, watching as they made their way up the curved driveway on foot amid the procession of expensive vehicles. Inside, the mansion's grand foyer buzzed with the city's elite. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow sparkles across marble floors, while waiters in crisp uniforms circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Sarah felt the stares, immediately curious, dismissive, occasionally pitying glances that followed them as they moved through the crowd. Will Harrison spotted them from across the room, a cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He approached with exaggerated warmth, loud enough to draw attention. "Ah, special guests have arrived. The waitress who would be a concert pianist." His voice carried just enough mockery to elicit titters from nearby guests. Tommy pressed closer to Sarah's side, sensing the hostility beneath the polite veneer. Will's gaze fell on him, and his smile widened. And this must be the prodigy, Tell me, boy, does your mother make you practice between serving tables? Before Sarah could respond, a woman in an expensive designer dress interjected, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Oh, Will, you shouldn't tease. It's so admirable when the lower classes try to better themselves through culture. More laughs followed, less restrained now. Sarah stood straight, her hand protective on Tommy's shoulder. We came because we were invited, Mr. Harrison. If our presence offends you? Offend? Not at all, Will interrupted, gesturing grandly. In fact, I insist you both perform for us. You did mention the boy plays, didn't you? Let's see what kind of education one can get in between hospital visits. The crowd parted, creating a path to the grand piano that dominated one corner of the room. It was Emily's piano, though Will hadn't allowed anyone to touch it since her death. Now he was offering it up as a tool of humiliation. Sarah hesitated, but Tommy squeezed her hand. It's okay, Mum, he whispered. Remember what we practiced. His quiet dignity in the face of their mockery brought tears to her eyes. They made their way to the piano, aware of every whisper, every smirk. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she sat at the bench, Tommy standing beside her. The piano's keys gleamed in the chandelier light, pristine from disuse. Will's voice cut through the expectant silence. Perhaps something simple? We wouldn't want to strain your capabilities. Sarah's fingers found the opening notes of Song of the Soul, the same piece she'd played at Will's wedding, the piece that had meant so much to Emily. Tommy's clear voice joined the piano, pure and true, filling the massive room with unexpected beauty. For a moment the mockery died away. The guests fell silent, caught off guard by the genuine artistry before them. Even Will's smirk faltered as memories of Emily threatened to break through his carefully constructed walls. But then Tommy faltered, his voice catching. Sarah saw the color drain from his face, recognized the signs she'd grown to fear. She tried to stop playing, to reach for him, but he shook his head stubbornly, determined to finish. Look, someone whispered loudly. The boy can't even make it through one song. Laughter rippled through the crowd again, cruel and cutting. Tommy swayed on his feet, his voice growing weaker. Will watched with growing discomfort as the boy's struggle became more apparent. This wasn't the entertaining spectacle he'd planned. It was becoming something else entirely. Mum, Tommy's whisper was barely audible before his knees buckled. Sarah caught him as he collapsed, the final notes of their performance dying in chaos as gasped and backed away. Someone call an ambulance. Sarah's cry echoed through the suddenly silent room. She cradled Tommy's limp form, no longer caring about the watching crowd or their judgment. Will stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. In Tommy's pale face he saw another face, Emily's, in those final moments at the hospital. The cruelty of what he'd done hit him with the force of a physical blow. As sirens wailed in the distance, the elegant party dissolved into chaos. Sarah's worn blue dress pooled around her on the marble floor as she held her son, whispering prayers and promises. The contrast between their genuine love and the shallow mockery of the party guests couldn't have been starker. The night that was meant to be their humiliation had become something else entirely, a turning point that would force everyone present to confront their own humanity or lack thereof. In the chaotic aftermath of Tommy's collapse, the Harrison mansion slowly emptied of guests, leaving behind half-empty champagne glasses and whispered gossip. Will stood in his study, a tumbler of scotch trembling in his hand as he replayed the evening's events. The sound of Tommy's faltering voice haunted him, mixing with memories of Emily's final days. Seeking escape from his thoughts, Will found himself drawn to Emily's music room, a space he hadn't entered since her death. The key felt heavy in his hand as he unlocked the door for the first time in 3 years. Dust motes danced in the beam of light that followed him inside, the air thick with neglect and memory. The grand piano stood silent under its cover, exactly as he'd left it. But something was different. There, propped against the music stand, was an envelope he didn't remember, cream-colored, aged, with Emily's distinctive handwriting across the front, to be opened when the music returns. Will's hands shook as he picked up the letter. Emily had always been one for such gestures, leaving notes and small surprises for him to find. But this had waited patiently for 3 years while he drowned himself in bitterness and wealth. "My dearest Will," the letter began, Emily's voice seeming to whisper the words in his mind. "If you're reading this, it means you finally unlocked the music room again. I've been waiting for this moment, my love, waiting for you to remember who you truly are." Will sank onto the piano bench, the scotch forgotten as he read on. "I know my death will hurt you deeply. I know you'll want to shut everything out, especially the music. But Will, the music was never just about me. It was about the power to heal, to connect, to give hope to those who need it most." Emily's words flowed on, speaking of her dreams for the music room, dreams of creating a foundation to support young musicians in need, of using their wealth to open doors for talented children who couldn't afford proper training or instruments. She spoke of the joy she'd found in teaching, of how music could bridge the gaps between worlds. "There's a trust fund," the letter revealed, "set aside specifically for this purpose. I've arranged everything with Michael. He knows the full details. I couldn't bear the thought of our fortune being used only for more fortune, when there are so many Emilys out there who just need one chance. One person to believe in them." Will's vision blurred as he read the final paragraphs. "My last wish, my love, is for you to find these children, these hidden talents who remind you of the passion I lived for. Help them, Will. Let their music heal your heart as mine once did. And when you find them, remember true wealth isn't in what we keep, but in what we give." "Look in the second drawer of my desk," the letter instructed. "There's something else waiting for you." With trembling fingers, Will opened the drawer. Inside lay a folder containing detailed plans for a music foundation, along with a list of young musicians Emily had been monitoring, talented children from underprivileged backgrounds. There, on the last page updated before her death, was a familiar name, Sarah Matthews, noted as exceptional talent, teaching music despite hardships. The realization hit Will like a physical blow. Sarah hadn't been just another waitress at his wedding, she had been one of Emily's prospects, someone his wife had hoped to help. And tonight he had used her and her sick child as entertainment for his wealthy friends, corrupting everything Emily had believed in. The sound of distant sirens still echoed from the front of the house, where an ambulance was presumably taking Tommy to the hospital. Will looked at his reflection in the piano's polished surface, and for the first time in years, he didn't recognize himself. What had he become? What? Emily's final words on the page seemed to glow. "Remember, my darling, it's never too late to start playing the right notes again. Love always, Emily." Will clutched the letter to his chest, tears finally breaking through the walls he'd built around his grief. In trying to honor Emily's memory by shutting out the world, he had betrayed everything she stood for. But perhaps it wasn't too late to change the melody. The hospital corridor stretched endlessly before Sarah as she paced outside the intensive care unit. The harsh fluorescent lights cast shadows under her eyes, still wearing the navy blue dress from the gala, now wrinkled from hours of anxious waiting. Tommy had been unconscious for 6 hours, his condition more serious than any previous episode. Dr. Anderson emerged from Tommy's room, her face grave. "Sarah, we need to talk," she said softly, leading her to a quiet consultation room. "Tommy's condition is accelerating faster than we anticipated. His heart is struggling to keep up with the demands of his body. Without the experimental treatment we discussed," I'm afraid she paused, choosing her words carefully. "We may be looking at months rather than years." Sarah gripped the edge of the chair, her knuckles white. "But the treatment, you said there's a good chance it could help him," her voice cracked with desperate hope. "The success rate is promising, yes. But Sarah, we've discussed the costs. Even with insurance, you're looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars. And Tommy needs to start soon. His body won't be strong enough for the treatment if we wait too long. Through the consultation room window, Sarah could see Tommy's room across the hall. Even unconscious, he looked small and fragile against the white hospital sheets, surrounded by beeping monitors and IV lines. The sight of her vibrant, musical boy reduced to this made her heart constrict painfully. A nurse entered Tommy's room to check his vitals, and Sarah watched as she gently adjusted his oxygen mask. The nurse, Linda, had been with them through many hospital stays. She'd often sneak Tommy extra pudding cups and listen to him sing when he was feeling stronger. Now she moved with the careful efficiency of someone handling precious, breakable things. "There has to be something we can do," Sarah whispered, more to herself than to Dr. Anderson. Some program, some charity. Her voice trailed off as she remembered the cruel laughter at the gala, the way the wealthy guests had watched her son collapse with more curiosity than concern. Dr. Anderson placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder. "There's something else you should know. The latest tests show that the strain of performing, the physical and emotional stress, it's making his condition worse. Sarah, I know music means everything to Tommy, but right now he needs complete rest." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Music was Tommy's life, his joy, his connection to the world. How could she tell him he had to give up the one thing that made him feel normal, that gave him hope? As if on cue, Tommy stirred in his hospital bed. Sarah rushed to his side, Dr. Anderson following close behind. His eyes fluttered open, immediately searching for his mother's face. Mommy's voice was barely a whisper behind the oxygen mask. "Did we finish the song?" Sarah fought back tears as she smoothed his hair. "You were beautiful, baby." So beautiful she couldn't bring herself to tell him that their performance had ended in chaos and crisis. Tommy's fingers twitched on the blanket, moving in the pattern of piano keys, playing silent music even in his weakened state. "Can we try again? Maybe if we practice more." Dr. Anderson stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Tommy, your heart needs rest right now. No more performances for a while, okay?" The devastation in Tommy's eyes was almost unbearable. "But music is our special thing," he protested weakly, looking at Sarah. "How can we make things better if we can't play?" Sarah gathered her son carefully in her arms, mindful of the tubes and wires. Sometimes love means knowing when to rest, when to let the music play in our hearts, instead of our hands. But even as she spoke the words, she felt the weight of their shared dreams slipping away. Later that night, after Tommy had fallen asleep, Sarah stood at the window of his hospital room, watching the city lights blur through her tears. The experimental treatment that could save him might as well have been on another planet for all their ability to afford it. And now, even their ability to make music together, their one source of joy and hope, had been taken away. In the quiet of the hospital night, Sarah began to hum softly Song of the Soul, the piece that had started everything. As she reached the part where Tommy's voice should join in, the silence felt deafening. Outside the window, a shooting star streaked across the sky, and Sarah found herself making a wish, something she hadn't done since she was a child. "Please," she whispered to the night, "don't let the music end like this." Michael Anderson stood in the hospital corridor, watching Sarah through the window of Tommy's room. As one of the city's most successful music producers, he'd heard countless talented musicians, but something about Tommy and Sarah's interrupted performance at the gala had touched him deeply. It wasn't just their skill, it was the raw emotion, the pure love that flowed through their music. He clutched a worn photograph in his hand, a young Sarah Matthews accepting a piano competition trophy, standing next to his late sister Grace. The resemblance was unmistakable, the same determined set of the jaw, the same graceful hands. Michael had spent years searching for his sister's daughter, never imagining he would find her in such circumstances. Taking a deep breath, he knocked softly on the door. Sarah turned, surprise registering on her exhausted face as she recognized him from the gala. "Mr. Anderson? Aye. We're not really up for visitors right now." "Please call me Michael," he said gently, stepping into the room. "I'm not here as a guest. I'm here because," he paused, looking at the sleeping Tommy, then back at Sarah, "because I believe I'm your uncle." Sarah's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief as Michael held out the photograph. Her hands trembled as she took it, recognizing her mother instantly. "But how? My mother never mentioned having a brother. Grace and I were separated when our parents divorced. She went with our father, I stayed with our mother. We lost touch. By the time I found her again, she had passed away." Michael's voice cracked with old grief. "I've been looking for you ever since." Sarah sank into the chair beside Tommy's bed, the photograph clutched to her chest. "Why now? Why here?" "When I heard you play at the gala, I knew. You have Grace's touch on the keys, that same way of making the music speak directly to the soul." And Tommy glanced at the sleeping boy. "He has her gift too." Before Sarah could respond, Tommy stirred, his eyes opening slowly. "Mom," then, recognizing Michael, he tried to sit up straighter. "You're the famous producer. I saw your picture in music magazines." Michael moved closer to the bed, smiling warmly. "And you're the brave young man who stole the show last night. How are you feeling, Tommy?" "Tired," Tommy admitted. "The doctor says I can't perform anymore." His voice caught on the last words, and Sarah reached for his hand. Michael pulled up another chair. "Sometimes, Tommy, the most beautiful music is the kind we prepare for, the kind we work towards. Think of it as a rest in the music, not an ending, but a pause before something wonderful." He turned to Sarah, his expression serious. "I know about the experimental treatment. As your uncle, as Tommy's great uncle, I want to help. The treatment, the best care, whatever you need, consider it done." Sarah shook her head, pride warring with desperation. "We can't accept that kind of help. We're strangers to you." "No," Michael said firmly, "your family. Grace would never forgive me if I didn't help her daughter and grandson. Besides," he added with a gentle smile, "I have a business proposition as well." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a contract. "This is a recording deal for both of you. Once Tommy is stronger, of course. Your performance last night, brief as it was, showed me what real music can be. The world needs to hear your story, your songs." Tommy's eyes lit up for the first time since his collapse. "A real record deal. Like real musicians." "You are real musicians," Michael corrected gently. "You always have been. Now we just need to get you well enough to share your gift with the world." Sarah stared at the contract, then at the photograph, then at her son's hopeful face. "You're really my mother's brother." Michael nodded, reaching into his pocket and pulling out an old locket. "Grace gave me this the last time I saw her. She said to give it to her daughter. When I found her," he placed it in Sarah's palm. "Open it." Inside was a tiny photograph of Grace at the piano, young Sarah on her lap, their hands on the keys together. On the other side was engraved, "The music never truly ends." Tears rolled down Sarah's cheeks as years of loneliness and struggle caught up with her. Michael stood and did what uncles are supposed to do. He hugged his niece, letting her cry against his shoulder, while Tommy watched with wide, wondering eyes. "Let us help you," Michael whispered. "Let the music play again." Despite Michael's generous offer to help with Tommy's treatment, Sarah insisted on contributing what she could. Pride and independence had been her companions for too long to simply step aside. She kept her job at the Blue Note, now working triple shifts that left her exhausted but determined. The regulars, who had heard about Tommy's condition, began leaving larger tips, their small kindnesses bringing tears to her eyes. In the quiet hours between shifts, Sarah would sit by Tommy's hospital bed, grading papers from the piano students she'd started teaching on weekends. Her hands, once reserved for concert halls, now moved from serving drinks to teaching beginners to filing insurance paperwork with equal grace. The hospital staff had set up a small keyboard in Tommy's room, though he was still too weak to play. Sometimes, Sarah would run her fingers silently over the keys, practicing without sound so as not to disturb the other patients. "Mom, you don't have to work so hard," Tommy would say, watching her nod off in the uncomfortable hospital chair. Uncle Michael said he'd take care of everything. The word uncle still felt new and strange on his tongue, a reminder of how quickly their world had changed. But Sarah would just smile, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. Some things, baby, a mother needs to do for herself. For her child, she didn't tell him about selling her mother's antique jewelry, or about the second mortgage she'd taken on their tiny apartment. Some burdens weren't meant for children to bear. The experimental treatment was brutal. Tommy's body, already weakened, struggled against the aggressive therapy. There were days when he couldn't keep food down, when even the thought of music made him too tired. Sarah learned to read medical charts, to understand the complex terminology that now governed their lives. She became an expert at distracting Tommy during painful procedures, telling him stories about his grandmother Grace's concerts, weaving tales of music and magic that helped him through the worst moments. One particularly difficult night, after a challenging treatment session, Sarah found herself in the hospital chapel. The small space was empty except for an old upright piano in the corner. Her fingers found the keys without thought, and she began to play for the first time since the gala. The melody of Song of the Soul filled the chapel, but this time it was different, slower, deeper, carrying all the pain and hope and love that words couldn't express. She didn't notice the night nurse standing in the doorway until the last note faded away. "That was beautiful," the nurse said softly. "Tommy's been asking for you. He said he could hear the music through the walls, said it helped with the pain." Sarah discovered that the other patients on Tommy's floor had heard the music too. An elderly man with cancer requested that she play again the next night. A young girl recovering from surgery asked if she could learn the song. Slowly, without planning it, Sarah began giving informal concerts in the chapel every evening after her shifts. The hospital staff would leave the doors open, letting the music drift through the sterile corridors, bringing warmth to the cold hospital nights. Michael found her there one evening, her head bowed over the keys, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "Sarah," he said gently, "you don't have to carry this alone anymore. Grace wouldn't want this for you." But Sarah shook her head, her fingers never leaving the keys. "I'm not alone. I have Tommy, I have you, I have this music, and every extra shift, every late night, every sacrifice, it's all part of the song we're playing together. I need to do my part." The treatments continued week after week. Sarah sold her car, walking or taking the bus between the hospital, work, and home. She moved their few belongings into a smaller apartment, closer to the hospital but in a rougher neighborhood. Each sacrifice was a note in her private symphony of motherhood, a melody of love played out in the currency of time and effort and determination. One morning, Dr. Anderson called Sarah into her office with unexpected news. Tommy's latest tests showed improvement, small but significant. The treatment was working, though there was still a long road ahead. When Sarah told Tommy, his first question was not about going home or feeling better, but about when he could play the piano again. That night, Sarah sat in the chapel again, playing a different version of their song, this time with hope rising in the melody like the sun after a long darkness. She thought about the path that had brought them here, a cruel invitation to a birthday party, a collapsed performance, a family reunion, and countless sacrifices, both large and small. Each hardship had become a note in their story, creating a symphony more powerful than anything she had played in her concert days. As her fingers moved over the keys, Sarah realized that some sacrifices weren't sacrifices at all, they were investments in love, deposits in the bank of hope, each one bringing them closer to the day when Tommy would be strong enough to join her at the piano again. The music they would make then would be richer for every struggle, every sacrifice, every moment of grace found in the midst of hardship. The discovery of Emily's letter shattered Will Harrison's carefully constructed world of wealth and indifference. Each night he found himself in his study, drinking expensive scotch and reading her words over and over until they blurred before his eyes. The trust fund she had set aside for young musicians remained untouched, while his own fortune began to crumble under the weight of his self-destruction. During board meetings, Will would stare blankly at financial reports, his mind replaying Tommy's collapse at the gala. His decisions became erratic, driven by guilt and alcohol rather than business sense. He began making risky investments, as if trying to punish himself for his cruelty. The whispers in the corporate corridors grew louder. The great William Harrison was losing his grip. "Will, you need help," Michael warned during a rare lunch meeting. The restaurant was high-end, but Will's disheveled appearance drew concerned glances from other diners. "Emily's foundation is sitting there, waiting to do good work. Instead, you're drowning yourself in guilt and scotch." But Will waved him off, ordering another drink before noon. "What do you know about guilt, Michael? You didn't see their faces, Sarah and Tommy, when everyone was laughing. I did that. Me, the great William Harrison, using a sick child for entertainment." The drinking escalated. Will started missing important meetings, showing up late to client presentations, or worse, showing up drunk. His executive board called an emergency session, presenting him with a choice: take a leave of absence or face a vote of no confidence. Will resigned on the spot, storming out of the boardroom that had been his domain for so long. The financial markets seemed to sense his weakness. Competitors swooped in on deals he'd neglected, and his investment portfolio began to hemorrhage money. Will hardly noticed, too lost in his spiral of self-loathing to care. He sold assets randomly, sometimes at massive losses, just to maintain his drinking lifestyle. The mansion staff began to quit, one by one, unable to watch their employers' descent. Bills went unpaid, utilities were cut off, and the once immaculate gardens grew wild. The only room Will maintained was the music room, though he never played the piano. He would sit there for hours, Emily's letter in one hand, a drink in the other, surrounded by the ghost of the man he used to be. One night, stumbling home from his latest binge, Will found himself outside the Blue Note. Through the window, he could see Sarah working her late shift, moving between tables with quiet dignity. The sight stopped him cold. Here was a woman who had every reason to crumble under life's pressures, yet she carried on with grace, fighting for her son's life while he, with all his advantages, was throwing his away. The next morning, nursing another hangover, Will received a notice from his bank. His accounts were overdrawn, his credit cards maxed out. The financial empire he'd built was collapsing, and this time there would be no golden parachute to save him. As he stared at the papers, his hands shaking from withdrawal, Will realized he had become everything he once despised: weak, pathetic, unable to face reality without a drink. In a moment of clarity, or perhaps desperation, Will pulled out his phone and called Michael. "I found rock bottom," he said simply. "It's not as exclusive as I thought it would be." Michael's response was immediate and practical. "Pack a bag. I'm sending a car. There's a private rehabilitation facility upstate, the same one where Emily's father got sober. It's time to face your demons, Will." As Will packed, he passed Emily's portrait in the hallway. For the first time since her death, he really looked at it, at the joy in her eyes, the love of life that had drawn him to her. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the painting. "I forgot who I was supposed to be." The rehabilitation center was nothing like the luxury spas Will had imagined. It was stark, clinical, and utterly indifferent to his former status. In group therapy, he sat alongside former truck drivers, teachers, and office workers, all of them equal in their struggle against addiction. For the first time in years, Will had to face himself without the cushion of wealth or the numbing embrace of alcohol. During his third week of sobriety, Will received news that his mansion was being foreclosed. His lawyer, trying to be gentle, explained that years of negligence and reckless spending had left him nearly bankrupt. The irony wasn't lost on Will. He had fallen as far as he had once feared Sarah and Tommy would fall. But in the clarity of sobriety, Will began to see his financial ruin not as an ending, but as a chance for redemption. He thought of Emily's words about true wealth lying in what we give, not what we keep. Perhaps he realized he had to lose everything to remember what really mattered. In his simple room at the rehabilitation center, Will began to write first to Emily, letters he would never send, then to Sarah and Tommy, apologies he wasn't yet brave enough to deliver. The words came slowly at first, then in a flood, as if years of buried emotions were finally finding their way to the surface. The truth emerged on a quiet Sunday afternoon in Tommy's hospital room. Sarah was showing him old photographs she'd found in Grace's locket when Michael rushed in, holding a weathered journal. His face was flushed with excitement and disbelief. "Sarah, you need to see this," he said, carefully opening the journal to a marked page. "I was going through Grace's old papers, trying to find more family history, and I found something extraordinary." The journal, it turned out, belonged to Grace Matthews, and its pages held a secret that would connect all their lives in an unexpected way. Grace's elegant handwriting filled the pages with memories of her time teaching at the city's prestigious music conservatory. Among her favorite students, she wrote, was a young woman named Emily Parker, the same Emily who would later become Emily Harrison, Will's wife. "Listen to this," Michael read aloud. "Emily reminds me so much of my Sarah, the same passion for music, the same desire to use it to help others. Today she told me about her plans to marry William Harrison. I pray she can help him see that true wealth lies in what music can do for the soul." Sarah sat heavily in her chair, memories flooding back. "I remember her now, the kind lady who used to bring sheet music to our house when Mom was too sick to teach. She would sit with me at the piano, telling me stories about her students while Mum rested." Tommy, propped up in his hospital bed, listened with wide eyes. "So Mrs. Harrison was your mom's student, and she knew about us?" Michael nodded, turning another page. "There's more. Emily kept in touch with Grace until the end. She was the anonymous donor who paid for Grace's medical treatments in her final months, and..." He paused, his voice catching. "She made a promise to Grace that she would look after Sarah's musical education." The journal revealed that Emily had been secretly tracking Sarah's career, planning to offer her a scholarship through the Harrison Foundation. But Emily's own illness and death had intervened, leaving the promise unfulfilled and Sarah's talent hidden behind a waitress's apron. As they absorbed this news, a nurse appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Harrison is here," she announced. "He's asking to speak with you." Will entered the room slowly, looking nothing like the imperious man who had hosted the gala. Rehabilitation had stripped away his artificial polish, leaving him humbled but somehow more genuine. He carried a familiar cream-colored envelope, Emily's letter. "I owe you all an apology," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "But more than that, I owe you an explanation." He handed the letter to Sarah. "Emily knew about you, about your mother, about everything. She had plans, beautiful plans that I was too blind and bitter to see." Sarah read the letter silently, tears falling onto the paper. Emily's words spoke of music's power to heal, of her dreams for the foundation, and of a particular young pianist she'd been watching, a woman who played with her heart as much as her hands. That night at the gala, Will continued, "I wasn't just being cruel to strangers. I was betraying my wife's last wishes, destroying the very connections she had worked to preserve." Tommy, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Mom always says music finds a way to bring the right people together." Will smiled sadly. "Your mom is very wise, Tommy. Emily used to say the same thing." He turned to Sarah. "The foundation Emily created, it's still there, waiting. She meant it for people like you and Tommy, people who understand that music is about more than just playing notes." Michael stepped forward, placing a hand on his sister's journal. "So here we are, all connected by two remarkable women who understood the true power of music. Grace and Emily's legacy lives in all of us." The room fell silent as they all absorbed the weight of these revelations. Through twists of fate and the invisible threads of music, their lives had been intertwined all along. Emily and Grace, though gone, had orchestrated a symphony of connection that was only now reaching its crescendo. Sarah looked around the room at her Uncle Michael, at the humbled Will Harrison, at her son Tommy, who embodied all the musical dreams of both Grace and Emily, and felt the strings of destiny pulling tight. Their shared past was rewriting their future, turning a story of cruelty and hardship into one of redemption and hope. "So what happens now?" Tommy asked, voicing the question in everyone's minds. Will straightened his shoulders, a glimmer of his old confidence returning, but tempered now with humility. "Now we honor their legacy, together, the way Emily and Grace always intended." 3 months after Tommy's successful treatment completion, Michael Anderson orchestrated what was to be the most significant musical event of the season, the Song of the Soul, a benefit concert for young musicians. The newly established Harrison Matthews Foundation would launch that night with Sarah and Tommy's performance as its centerpiece. The city's grand concert hall buzzed with anticipation. Photographers crowded the entrance, capturing images of celebrities and socialites arriving in their finest. Behind the scenes, Sarah adjusted Tommy's bow tie, her hands trembling slightly. This was their moment, not just to perform, but to help other children who dreamed of music but couldn't afford lessons or instruments. "You look just like Grandma Grace in her concert photos," Tommy said, touching the vintage pearl necklace Michael had given Sarah, a family heirloom returned. She wore a proper concert gown now, midnight blue with silver accents, but her eyes held the same determined dignity she'd shown in her waitress uniform. Will Harrison, 6 months sober and rebuilding his life, paced backstage. Though no longer wealthy, he had thrown himself into organizing the foundation, determined to honor Emily's wishes. "The hall is packed," he reported. "Every major music critic in the city is here." But not everyone celebrated their success. Marcus Sterling, Will's former business partner, who had taken control of Harrison Enterprises, watched from the wings with barely concealed contempt. He had opposed Will's decision to pour the last of his resources into the foundation, seeing it as one final act of corporate suicide. As Sarah began her pre-concert warm-up, she noticed something wrong with the grand piano. The keys felt sluggish, unresponsive. A quick inspection revealed the horrifying truth: someone had tampered with the mechanism, subtly sabotaging the instrument. "It's impossible to fix." Before the concert, the piano technician whispered. "The damage is too extensive. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." Panic threatened to overwhelm Sarah. This was no random act of vandalism, this was a calculated attempt to destroy their big moment. Through the curtain, she could hear the audience filling the hall, could feel Tommy's excitement beside her. They couldn't disappoint all these people, couldn't let down the children who would benefit from the foundation. Michael rushed to find another piano, but Sterling had been thorough. The backup instrument in the green room had been similarly sabotaged. Time was running out, and the whispers of delay were already circulating through the audience. Then Tommy spoke up, his voice clear and determined. "Mom, remember what you taught me? About making music with whatever we have." He pointed to the old upright piano in the practice room, the same model as their piano at home, worn but serviceable. "We don't need a fancy grand piano. We just need each other." Will overheard and understood immediately. "Move it onto the stage," he commanded. "Now." The stage crew scrambled to comply, rolling the modest upright into the spotlight meant for the gleaming grand. The audience murmured in confusion as the curtain rose, revealing not the expected sight of luxury, but a simple, well-loved instrument that had taught countless beginning students. Sarah stepped onto the stage, Tommy beside her. Instead of apologizing for the change, she sat at the upright with quiet pride. This was fitting. She realized their music had never been about glamour or perfection. It had always been about heart, about making beauty from whatever life gave you. As her fingers touched the keys, Sarah felt all the love and struggle and triumph of their journey pour through her hands. Tommy's voice joined in, pure and strong, no longer the fragile child from the gala, but a confident young musician sharing his gift with the world. The upright piano, though humble, rang with a warmth and sincerity that no sabotage could diminish. Their performance of Song of the Soul brought tears to the eyes of even the most hardened critics. In the wings, Sterling watched in disbelief as his attempt to humiliate them transformed into a moment of authentic beauty. When they finished, the silence lasted for one breathless moment before the audience erupted in a standing ovation. Critics wiped their eyes, society ladies dabbed at their makeup, and hardened businessmen found themselves cheering for a kind of wealth that couldn't be measured in dollars. Michael found Sterling trying to slip away backstage. "You should know," he said quietly, "that security cameras caught everything. But we won't press charges. Tonight isn't about revenge, it's about showing how music transcends all the barriers we create." The sabotaged concert had backfired spectacularly. Instead of highlighting their limitations, it had showcased their greatest strength, the ability to create beauty despite obstacles, to find music in the most humble of circumstances. As Sarah and Tommy took their final bow, their story of perseverance resonated far beyond the concert hall, touching hearts and changing lives in ways no grand piano ever could. The triumph of overcoming the sabotaged piano was still reverberating through the concert hall when Sarah noticed something wrong. Tommy, still beaming from their first successful piece, swayed slightly as they prepared for their encore. His face, flushed with excitement moments before, suddenly drained of color. "Mum," he whispered, the microphone catching his voice. "Something's wrong." The words echoed through the hall, eerily similar to that fateful night at the gala. Sarah's heart stopped as she saw the same signs she'd prayed never to see again: the pallor, the trembling hands, the unfocused eyes. The audience, still standing from their ovation, fell into a hushed silence as Tommy stumbled. Will Harrison, watching from the wings, was already moving, memories of the gala driving him forward. But this time he wasn't a cruel observer, he was family, racing to help. Dr. Anderson, who had been in the audience monitoring Tommy's first public performance since his treatment, rushed toward the stage. "Get him lying down," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of countless medical emergencies. "And someone clear the hall." Sarah cradled Tommy's head in her lap, her concert gown pooling around them on the stage. "Stay with me, baby," she pleaded as Tommy's eyes fluttered. "The music's not finished yet. We have so many more songs to play." The great concert hall, packed moments ago with society's elite, erupted into controlled chaos. Michael took charge, his voice steady over the PA system. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm and exit through the main doors. Our medical team needs space to work." Will knelt beside them, his sobriety medallion catching the stage lights as he held Tommy's hand. "Hold on, champion," he whispered. "You're stronger than this. We all know you are." The paramedics arrived with shocking speed. Michael had insisted on having an ambulance on standby, a precaution that now seemed prophetic. As they worked over Tommy, Sarah felt herself being gently pulled back, giving them room to help her son. The stage lights seemed too bright, too harsh, illuminating every parent's worst nightmare. "His heart rhythm is irregular," one paramedic announced, attaching monitoring leads to Tommy's chest. "We need to move him now." The stretcher appeared, and Tommy's small form was lifted onto it, his bow tie askew, his concert clothes suddenly making him look younger and more vulnerable. Through her tears, Sarah saw Marcus Sterling standing in the wings, his face ashen. The man who had tried to sabotage their performance now watched as real tragedy unfolded, his petty revenge forgotten in the face of a child's suffering. As they rushed Tommy through the backstage area, his hand shot out, grabbing the edge of the upright piano. "The song," he gasped, his voice barely audible. "We didn't finish the song." Sarah's heart shattered at his words. Even now, her brave boy was thinking of the music, of the promise they'd made to help other children through the foundation. She bent down to his level as the paramedics paused briefly. "The song lives in our hearts, baby," she whispered. "It's playing right now, and it will keep playing until you're strong enough to join in again." She kissed his forehead, feeling the fever burning beneath his skin. Will stepped forward, his voice steady despite his fear. The foundation launch will continue, Tommy. Your music tonight has already inspired donations that will help dozens of children. You've done it, son. You can rest now. The ride to the hospital was a blur of sirens and prayers. Sarah sat in the ambulance, still in her concert gown, holding Tommy's hand as the paramedics worked. The heart monitor beeped an erratic rhythm, each uncertain beat marking the distance between triumph and tragedy. In the emergency room, Dr. Anderson took charge, barking orders with the intensity of someone who refused to let death win. His body's rejecting the treatment, she explained quickly to Sarah. But we caught it early this time. We can fight this. The waiting room filled with an unlikely family. Michael, the uncle who had found them just in time, Will, the reformed antagonist turned devoted friend, and even Bob from the Blue Note, still in his bartender's apron, having rushed over as soon as he heard the news. As dawn broke over the city, they all held their breath, waiting for news about the boy who had brought them together, whose music had begun healing old wounds and building new bridges. The stage lights had dimmed, but Tommy's song played on in their hearts, a melody of hope against fear, of love against loss, of family found in the most unexpected places. In the sterile hospital waiting room, Will Harrison made a decision that would alter all their lives. While Sarah sat vigil at Tommy's bedside, he retreated to his modest apartment, a far cry from his former mansion, and began making calls to every contact he had left in his diminished social circle. "Listen," he said into his phone, pacing the small living room. "I need access to that experimental treatment program in Switzerland. Yes, the one with the 90% success rate. I know it's expensive. I know it's a waiting list, but there's a boy who needs it now." Will's voice, once commanding boardrooms with arrogant authority, now carried a different kind of power, the desperate determination of a man seeking redemption. He had sold almost everything he owned after rehabilitation, but he still had one last asset, Emily's personal art collection, which he'd kept out of sentiment. Without hesitation, Will contacted his art dealer. "Sell everything," he instructed. "Every painting, every sculpture. I don't care about getting top dollar, we need the funds immediately." Each piece represented a memory with Emily, but he knew now that this was how she would want her legacy used. Michael found Will at dawn, surrounded by paperwork in the hospital's chapel. "What are you doing?" he asked, seeing the intense focus in Will's eyes. Emily's letter mentioned other treatment options, experimental programs she'd researched before her own illness took her. She kept files on everything, hoping to help other families someday. Will looked up, his face showing the strain of hours of work. "I found the program she would have wanted for Tommy." The Swiss Treatment Center was the world's leading facility for cases like Tommy's, but the cost was astronomical, and the waiting list was years long. Will had spent the night calling in every remaining favor, leveraging the last vestiges of his former influence. "I've sold everything," Will explained to Michael. "The art collection, my car, my watches, even Emily's jewelry." She would understand. "But it's still not enough, and time is running out." Michael sat down heavily beside him. "Will, you've already done so much. No one expects you to." "You don't understand," Will interrupted. "That night at the gala, I used a sick child suffering for entertainment. I mocked a mother's love and dedication. If I don't make this right, Emily's death meant nothing. My recovery means nothing." Together, they approached Sarah with the plan. She sat beside Tommy's hospital bed, holding his hand while machines monitored his failing heart. Will explained about the Swiss facility, about Emily's research, about selling his last possessions. "The foundation was supposed to launch tonight," Sarah said quietly, "to help other children. How can we use that money for just Tommy?" "Because Tommy isn't just one child," Will replied. "He's the embodiment of everything Emily believed in: the power of music to heal, the importance of giving everyone a chance. Saving him means saving her dream." But even with Will's sacrifice, they were still short of the amount needed. That's when Marcus Sterling appeared in the doorway, his face showing the strain of a sleepless night. "I heard everything," he said, "and I want to help. Not as a business decision, not as publicity, but because I was wrong. About all of it, he held out a check that would cover the remaining cost. Consider it restitution for my attempt to ruin your concert. Within hours, the wheels were in motion. Will's contacts expedited the paperwork, while Michael arranged for medical transport. The Swiss doctors, after reviewing Tommy's case, agreed to take him immediately. As they prepared Tommy for the journey, Will sat with Sarah in the hospital chapel. "I know this doesn't make up for what I did," he said softly. "But Emily always said that true redemption isn't about erasing the past, it's about creating a better future." Sarah took his hand, remembering the cruel man from the gala who seemed so far removed from the person beside her now. "Emily would be proud of you," she said. "This is exactly what she meant in her letter about using wealth to make a difference." The morning sun streamed through the chapel windows as Tommy was wheeled toward the waiting air ambulance. Will watched as Sarah climbed aboard with her son, seeing in their hands clasped together the same love and determination he had once shared with Emily. "The music will play again," he whispered, echoing Emily's words from her letter. "For all of us." The true cost of Will's redemption became apparent in the weeks following Tommy's departure to Switzerland. The creditors he'd been holding at bay finally closed in, seizing what remained of his assets. His apartment was foreclosed, forcing him to move into a small room above the Blue Note, where Bob offered him shelter in exchange for helping manage the bar. The business world that had once revered him now treated him as a cautionary tale. Harrison's final fall read the financial papers detailing how the once mighty CEO had squandered his last resources on a waitress's sick child. Former associates crossed the street to avoid him, whispering about mental breakdowns and alcohol-induced insanity. Standing behind the bar one night, polishing glasses with the same hands that once signed million-dollar contracts, Will found himself serving drinks to his former board members. They barely recognized him, and when they did, their pity was worse than their disdain. "You know, Will," one of them said, the condescension thick in his voice, "there's still a position available in our Singapore office. Nothing prestigious, mind you, but it would be a fresh start. Away from all. This." He gestured vaguely at Will's bartender's apron. But Will just smiled, continuing to polish the glass in his hands. "There was a time when I would have measured my worth by the size of my office," he replied. "Now I measure it by the size of my impact." His new life was humble but purposeful. Each morning he attended his AAA meetings, proudly collecting his sobriety chips. During the days he worked with Michael on foundation paperwork, coordinating with other charities to identify promising young musicians in need. At night he tended bar, listening to people's stories with a humility he'd never possessed in his wealthy days. The loss of his material wealth had stripped away his artificial walls, revealing the man Emily had first fallen in love with. He kept her photo on his small bedside table, no longer a source of guilt, but of inspiration. "You'd laugh to see me now," he would tell her image, "but I think you'd understand." The final blow came when Marcus Sterling, despite his contribution to Tommy's treatment, orchestrated a complete takeover of Harrison Enterprises. The board voted unanimously to remove Will's name from the company he'd built. The Harrison building was renamed, and decades of his family's business legacy were erased overnight. Walking past his former building, now bearing Sterling's name, Will felt a strange sense of liberation. The empire he'd spent his life building had crumbled, but in its place, something more meaningful was growing. Every update from Switzerland about Tommy's progress, every letter from Sarah describing small improvements, confirmed that he had traded his fortune for something priceless. One rainy evening, as Will closed up the bar, he found Michael waiting for him. The foundation received its first major donation today, Michael announced. Anonymous, but substantial. Enough to fund music education for 50 children. Will smiled, wiping down the bar one last time. "Emily always said true wealth multiplies when you share it. I never understood that until now." His fall from grace was complete, But in losing everything, Will Harrison had finally found himself. The man who once measured success in dollars now counted it in children's smiles, in music lessons funded, in lives touched by the foundation that bore not his name, but Emily's. In Switzerland, Sarah faced her own kind of desperate struggle. Despite the advanced treatment center and world-class medical care, Tommy's condition remained precarious. The doctors spoke in carefully measured terms about complications and unexpected responses, while Sarah watched her son fight for every breath, every heartbeat. The sterile hospital corridors echoed with languages she didn't understand, but the language of motherly fear needed no translation. She learned to read the monitors, to interpret every slight change in Tommy's vital signs. At night she would sing softly to him, their special song becoming a lullaby of hope in the darkness. When the doctors suggested an additional experimental treatment, one not covered by the initial funding, Sarah didn't hesitate. She contacted Bob at the Blue Note, asking him to sell her piano, the last valuable thing she owned. The instrument that had been her mother's, that had taught Tommy his first notes, would now help save his life. "Are you sure?" Bob asked over the crackling international connection. "That piano is your history, your heritage." "Tommy is my future," Sarah replied simply. "And what good is a piano without him to play it?" But even this sacrifice wasn't enough. The new treatment costs were astronomical, far beyond what selling the piano could provide. Sarah began taking night shifts at a local cafe near the hospital, her rusty college German slowly improving as she served coffee to other worried parents and tired medical staff. During one particularly difficult night, when Tommy's fever spiked dangerously high, Sarah made a decision that would haunt her. She found a local medical research program that paid volunteers for testing new medications. The risks were significant, but the compensation was substantial. Mrs. Matthews, the research coordinator, warned, "These trials can have serious side effects. As a single mother, you should consider." "I'm considering my son," Sarah interrupted. "He's all that matters." The trials were brutal. Each session left her exhausted, dealing with various side effects while trying to maintain a brave face for Tommy. She hid the injection marks on her arms, wore long sleeves even in the warm hospital rooms, and never told anyone what she was doing. Michael, during his visits, noticed her growing pallor but attributed it to stress and lack of sleep. Will, receiving her updates about Tommy, sensed something was wrong but couldn't pinpoint what. Only the night nurse, Maria, seemed to understand, silently bringing Sarah extra blankets when the drug trials left her shaking with chills. One evening, as Sarah sat beside Tommy's bed, he stirred from his medication-induced sleep. "Mom," he whispered, "I heard you playing piano last night in my dreams. It was beautiful." Sarah held back tears, thinking of her souled piano, of the music they might never make together again. "Keep dreaming those beautiful dreams, baby," she said. "The music will always be there." That night, the side effects from the medical trials hit particularly hard. Sarah collapsed in the hospital bathroom, her body rebelling against the experimental drugs. Maria found her there, immediately understanding what she'd been doing. "You can't help him if you destroy yourself," the nurse scolded gently, helping her to a chair. "A boy needs his mother's strength, not her sacrifice." But Sarah looked at Tommy through the window of his room, watching his chest rise and fall with each precious breath. "Sometimes strength is sacrifice," she replied. "Sometimes love means giving everything, even yourself." The next morning, despite Maria's warnings, Sarah signed up for another trial. As she sat in the research clinic, watching the new drug drip into her veins, she hummed Song of the Soul quietly to herself. The melody that had once filled concert halls and brought audiences to their feet now served as a private prayer, a mother's desperate plea for her child's life. The truth emerged during one of Tommy's worst nights at the Swiss hospital. As his condition deteriorated, the doctors needed a complete family medical history. Sarah sat in Dr. Weber's office, exhausted from another research trial, when he asked about Tommy's biological parents. "We have no information," Sarah explained. "He was abandoned at the hospital when he was 3. His birth mother left no records, but even as she spoke the words she'd repeated so many times, something in Dr. Weber's expression made her pause. The doctor pulled out a thick file, its edges worn with age. "Mrs. Matthews, when your son was admitted, his DNA was entered into our international medical database. Last week we got a match." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "The match was to a former patient here, Emily Harrison." The world seemed to stop spinning. Sarah stared at the doctor, unable to process what she was hearing. Emily Harrison, Will's wife. Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. Dr. Weber nodded solemnly. "Mrs. Harrison was treated here before her death. She was pregnant at the time, but the baby was believed lost. According to these records, the child survived, but was extremely ill. She arranged for him to be taken to America, to be left at a hospital where she knew he would find the right home." How Sarah's voice cracked. How could she know? The doctor opened another file. "We found this letter in our archives. It was written by Emily Harrison. Just before she died, he handed Sarah a faded envelope, her hands trembling as she opened it. To the mother of my son," Emily's words jumped off the page. "If you're reading this, it means you're the one I prayed for. I watched you at the conservatory, saw how you played with such love and grace. I knew if my baby survived, he would need more than wealth and privilege. He would need music in his soul. When I learned I was dying, I arranged for him to be placed in your path. Love him, teach him, let him heal your heart as you heal his. The music will guide you both. With eternal gratitude, Emily." Sarah's tears fell onto the letter as years of mystery suddenly made sense. Tommy's natural musical ability, his inexplicable connection to Song of the Soul, the way he had seemed to recognize Emily's piano at the gala. He wasn't just any abandoned child, he was Emily's last gift to the world. Through the office window, Sarah could see Tommy sleeping in his hospital room. Will's features were suddenly obvious in the boy's face, the same determined set of his jaw, the same expressive hands. How many times had Will looked at his son without knowing it? "Does Will know?" she asked quietly. "Not yet," Dr. Weber replied. "As Tommy's legal mother, you had the right to be informed first. The decision to tell others rests with you." Sarah thought of Will, who had sacrificed everything to save a child he believed was a stranger. She thought of Emily, making the ultimate sacrifice to ensure her son would have not just life, but music and love. The weight of these revelations pressed on her heart. "Tommy is my son," she said firmly, "in every way that matters. But he deserves to know his whole story, and Will. Will deserves to know he hasn't lost everything after all." That night, Sarah sat beside Tommy's bed, watching him sleep. She hummed their special song, Emily's song, understanding now why it had always felt like more than just music. It was a bridge between two mothers, between past and present, between loss and love. "Your first mother gave you life," she whispered to Tommy. "She gave you music. She gave you to me. And now it's time to give you back to your father too. Our family just got bigger, baby boy." The monitors beeped steadily, marking time as Sarah began to write a letter of her own to Will, to Tommy, to the future they would all face together. Outside the hospital window, snow began to fall on the Swiss mountains, covering everything in a clean, white blanket, as if nature itself was preparing for a fresh start. The revelation of Tommy's true parentage set in motion the unraveling of an even more intricate plan Emily had woven before her death. Michael, digging through the Foundation's legal documents, discovered a hidden codicil in Emily's will, triggered only by the confirmation of her child's survival. In her private office at the Harrison Foundation, now temporarily housed in Michael's studio, he found a safe he'd never noticed before, concealed behind a painting of a grand piano. The combination was the first few notes of Song of the Soul. And inside lay a leather portfolio containing Emily's master plan. "My dearest Will," her final document began. "If you're reading this, our son has been found, and the music has brought our family full circle." The letter went on to reveal that Emily had secretly invested a substantial portion of her personal inheritance in a blind trust, one that would mature only when specific conditions were met. Those conditions now read like a prophecy. The child would be raised by someone who understood the true value of music. They would find their way back to the Harrison family through music itself. And Will would have to demonstrate that he had learned the difference between material wealth and true riches. Emily had orchestrated everything, working with her trusted lawyers to create an unbreakable trust that would ensure her fortune couldn't be touched by business losses or corporate takeovers. The fund had grown significantly over the years, managed by discreet trustees who had been following Emily's detailed instructions. She knew, Michael said in awe, sharing the discovery with Sarah and Will in Tommy's hospital room. She knew Will would lose his way after her death, knew the company might fail. She created a safety net that could only be accessed when we all learned what really mattered. The trust was substantial enough to not only cover all of Tommy's medical expenses, but also to restore the Harrison Matthews Foundation to its intended glory. Emily had effectively preserved her legacy, ensuring it would be used exactly as she'd hoped to bring music to those who needed it most. Will sat heavily in the hospital chair, reading and rereading Emily's words. "Even after death, she's teaching me," he said softly. "All this time I thought I was making amends, sacrificing everything to help Tommy. But Emily knew she knew I needed to lose everything to find what really mattered." Sarah, holding Tommy's hand as he slept, felt tears rolling down her cheeks. "She chose me," she whispered. "Out of all the people she could have trusted with her son, she chose me. She saw something in me worth believing in." The document's final page contained one last surprise: a provision that the Foundation's leadership must always be shared equally between the Harrison and Matthews families, ensuring that both business acumen and musical artistry would guide its future. "This isn't just an inheritance," Michael observed. "It's a symphony Emily composed for all of us, each playing our own vital part. The music that brought Tommy to Sarah, that brought Will back to himself, that brought all of us together. It was Emily conducting from beyond, making sure her love would keep playing." As they absorbed the magnitude of Emily's plan, Tommy stirred in his hospital bed. His first words upon waking were about music, asking if someone could play for him. Will and Sarah exchanged glances, understanding passing between them. They were no longer separate entities, the wealthy businessman and the struggling waitress, but partners in a legacy bigger than themselves. The discovery of Emily's inheritance plan led to another revelation, one that had been hidden in Grace Matthews' personal diaries. In the quiet hours of the Swiss hospital, while Tommy slept and Will made arrangements for the foundation, Sarah found Michael studying old family photographs with unusual intensity. "There's something I need to tell you," Michael said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I'm not just your mother's long-lost brother. I'm your biological father." He handed her a worn photograph showing a much younger version of himself with Grace, her mother. The truth spilled out like notes from a broken chord. Michael and Grace had been young musicians in love, but his budding career as a producer had taken him around the world. When Grace discovered she was pregnant, she chose not to tell him, believing it would derail his promising future. She raised Sarah alone, letting her daughter believe her father had abandoned them. "I never knew," Michael explained, his hands trembling. "Not until I found Grace's diaries after tracking down our family history. By then she was gone, and you," his voice caught. "You had already become an accomplished pianist in your own right." Sarah sat in stunned silence, memories reshaping themselves in her mind. The mysterious checks that had arrived during her competition years, always signed by an arts foundation. The anonymous sponsor who had funded her European tour. The strange coincidence that Michael Anderson, the famous producer, had been at so many pivotal moments in her career. "I was trying to help from afar," Michael admitted. "When I finally discovered the truth, I wanted to tell you immediately, but then Tommy got sick, and everything happened so fast." Tears rolled down his cheeks. I've spent years producing other people's music, never realizing my own daughter was creating the most beautiful melodies of all. The revelation explained so much Sarah's natural talent that had surprised even her mother, the inexplicable pull she'd felt toward music production, the way Michael had fought so fiercely for her, and Tommy from the moment they met. "Did Emily know?" Sarah asked suddenly, remembering how intricately their lives had been woven together. Michael nodded slowly. "She figured it out near the end. It was one of the reasons she trusted you with Tommy. She saw how Grace had raised you alone, saw the same strength in you that she hoped would protect her son." Tommy chose that moment to wake up, his voice weak but curious. "Mom? Why are you crying?" Sarah moved to his bedside, taking his hand. "Because sometimes, sweetheart, life writes the most unexpected melodies. Remember how you always said you wanted a bigger family? Well, it turns out we have one bigger and more wonderful than we ever imagined." Michael stood awkwardly at the foot of the bed, years of lost fatherhood weighing heavily on his shoulders. But Tommy, with a child's simple wisdom, simply smiled and said, "So you're not just my uncle anymore, you're my grandfather too." The tension broke as they all laughed through their tears. In that moment, the machines monitoring Tommy's heart seemed to beep in rhythm with their shared joy, a medical melody marking the pulse of a family rebuilding itself note by note. The final piece of their intertwined history emerged when Will arrived at the hospital the next morning, carrying a dusty old box he'd discovered in Emily's music room. Inside was a collection of conservatory programs, photographs, and handwritten sheet music that revealed the deepest connection between Emily and Sarah. "Look at this," Will said, carefully spreading the contents on Tommy's hospital bed. There was a photograph from 20 years ago, a teenage Sarah performing at a student recital, and in the audience, a young Emily watching with rapt attention. Behind them both stood Grace Matthews at the piano. Among the papers was Emily's diary from her time as Grace's student. The entries painted a picture of a deep bond between teacher and pupil, with frequent mentions of Grace's talented young daughter. "Sarah played for us today," one entry read. "Grace says she has music in her soul. I watched this little girl at the piano and saw something of myself in her eyes, that same hunger for music to mean something more than just notes on a page." Emily had tracked Sarah's career from afar, collecting reviews and programs from her performances. There were newspaper clippings about the Matthews family's financial troubles, about Grace's illness, about Sarah's disappearance from the classical music scene. Emily had witnessed it all, silently watching and planning. "She wrote this letter the day before she discovered her pregnancy," Will said softly, holding out a yellowed envelope. Inside, Emily had penned her thoughts about Grace's approach to teaching music, not just as an art form, but as a way of healing, of connecting souls. "If I ever have a child," Emily had written, "I want them to understand music the way Grace taught me, as a language of love, a bridge between hearts. And if anything happens to me, I pray they find their way to someone who understands this truth as deeply as Sarah does." The diary entries continued through Emily's pregnancy and illness, revealing how she had orchestrated everything. She had known she was dying, known her child would need more than wealth and privilege. In Sarah, she had seen the perfect guardian for her musical legacy, someone who understood that true wealth lay in the ability to touch hearts through music. She wasn't just choosing a mother for Tommy, Sarah realized, tears flowing freely. She was completing the circle my mother started. Grace taught Emily how music could heal, and Emily made sure that lesson would live on through us. Tommy, sitting up in his hospital bed and looking stronger every day, reached for the old sheet music. "This is Song of the Soul," he said wonderingly. "But it's different. There are notes here I've never seen before." Will looked closer. "That's Emily's handwriting. She must have been composing her own variation." He paused, emotion catching in his throat. "A duet, actually. Look at the title, For Grace's Daughter, When the Time Comes." Sarah sat at Tommy's bedside, reading through the music Emily had written specifically for her, a piece that would only be complete when played by both families together. It was Emily's final gift, a song that would require all of them to heal, to forgive, to play in harmony. She knew, Sarah whispered, touching the notes gently. She knew that someday we would all find each other, that the music would bring us home. 6 months after Tommy's recovery, the grand concert hall buzzed with anticipation once again. This time, however, it wasn't just a performance, it was a celebration of healing, of family found, and of music's power to transform lives. The stage held both Emily's restored grand piano and the humble upright from the Blue Note, symbolizing the bridging of two worlds. Photographs of Grace and Emily flanked the stage, watching over their legacy. The hall was packed, not just with society's elite, but with people from all walks of life: Bob and his bar staff, Tommy's doctors and nurses, children from the Foundation's music programs, and countless others touched by their story. Sarah emerged first, wearing Grace's vintage concert gown restored to its former glory. Will followed in a simple black suit, the sobriety medallion pinned to his lapel catching the stage lights. Michael sat at the sound controls, tears in his eyes as he watched his daughter and the man who had become family take their places. Then Tommy appeared, healthy and strong, his recovery complete. He carried sheet music, Emily's final composition, performed tonight for the first time. The audience fell silent as he took his place between his two parents at the upright piano. Tonight, Sarah spoke into the microphone, her voice steady and clear. We're not just playing music. We're celebrating the incredible journey that brought us here. This piece was written by Emily Harrison as a gift to connect two families, two worlds, and countless hearts. Will stepped forward. Emily always said that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch. Tonight, the Harrison Matthews Foundation launches its worldwide initiative to bring music education to children who need it most. The first notes of Song of the Soul, the family duet, filled the hall. Sarah and Tommy began at the upright, their fingers dancing across the keys in perfect synchronization. Then Will joined at the grand piano, playing the counter melody Emily had written all those years ago. The music told their story, the initial discord of their first meeting, the tension of separation, the harmony of understanding, and finally the pure joy of reunion. As they played, photos projected behind them showed their journey: Grace teaching Emily, Emily watching young Sarah perform, Tommy's first piano lesson, the failed gala performance, the hospital recovery, and finally, their new family together. Marcus Sterling, seated in the audience, wiped tears from his eyes as he watched the family he had once tried to destroy create something beautiful together. Bob from the Blue Note sat beside him, both men united in their appreciation of the miracle unfolding before them. The piece reached its crescendo, all three players weaving their parts together in a tapestry of sound that seemed to lift the very roof of the concert hall. As the final notes faded away, there was a moment of profound silence before the audience erupted in thunderous applause. Tommy beamed at his parents, both of them, before turning to the photographs of Grace and Emily. "We did it," he whispered. "We finished the song." In that moment, as waves of applause washed over them, they were more than musicians, more than a family. They were living proof that love, expressed through music, could heal any wound, bridge any divide, and create something beautiful from life's most difficult moments. After the benefit concert, Will Harrison's transformation became the talk of the city, but not for the reasons anyone might have expected. The man who had once measured success in dollars and deals now spent his days teaching business skills to young musicians, helping them navigate the practical aspects of their artistic careers. His office was no longer in a towering skyscraper, but in a converted classroom at the Harrison Matthews Foundation's new community music center. The walls, once adorned with expensive art, now displayed children's thank you drawings and photos of student recitals. His designer suits had given way to casual clothes that let him sit comfortably at the piano with his students. Money can build concert halls, he would tell his students, but music builds bridges between hearts. The words were Emily's, but he finally understood them deep in his soul. Each time he watched Tommy perform, each time he saw Sarah teaching a new student, he felt his late wife's wisdom guiding him toward a richer kind of wealth. The business world that had once shunned him now sought his advice, not on making profits but on using wealth to create meaningful change. Marcus Sterling, transformed by his own part in their story, became one of the foundation's biggest supporters, turning his corporate influence toward opening doors for young musicians. Will kept his small apartment above the Blue Note, though he could now afford better. The simple rooms reminded him of what really mattered. Each morning, he would stop at Emily's portrait in the foundation's lobby, touching his sobriety medallion and silently sharing with her the joy of another day lived with purpose. His greatest pride came not from business successes but from the moments shared with Tommy at the piano. Together, they would play the pieces Emily had loved, the father-son bond growing stronger with each note. "Your mother," he would tell Tommy, "knew that sometimes we have to lose our way to find our true path." The transformation that had begun in anger and guilt had blossomed into something beautiful, a redemption story told not in words but in music, in laughter, in the joy of a family rebuilt from broken pieces. Will Harrison had lost an empire but gained a symphony, and in the end, that made all the difference. 1 year after the benefit concert, the Harrison Matthews family gathered at Emily's restored music room for a very special celebration. The space, once locked in grief, now rang with laughter and music. Tommy, fully recovered and thriving, sat at his mother Emily's piano, playing a piece he had composed himself, a melody that wove together themes from both his family's stories. Sarah, no longer a waitress but the foundation's artistic director, watched her son with pride, her hand clasped in Michael's father and daughter, making up for lost time. Will stood nearby, his sobriety medallion now marking 2 years of clarity, smiling as he watched his son master the instrument that had once been a symbol of his loss. The room itself had been transformed. Photographs of both Emily and Grace hung side by side, watching over their legacy. Student artwork covered the walls, and well-worn sheet music scattered across every surface spoke of a space lived in and loved. The grand piano, once silent in mourning, now served as the heart of their weekly family gatherings. Mum Tommy called out to Sarah, "Come play the new ending with me." As Sarah joined him at the piano, Will took his place at the second piano. Emily's final duet had evolved into a 3-part harmony that seemed to embody their united family. Michael recorded everything, not as a famous producer, but as a proud grandfather capturing precious moments. Bob from the Blue Note, now a regular at their family dinners, sat in his usual corner, raising a glass of sparkling cider in tribute to the power of second chances. The foundation had flourished beyond their wildest dreams, with music programs spreading across the country. But their greatest achievement wasn't measured in grants or performances, it was in the love that filled this room, in the healing that had turned strangers into family, in the music that had transformed loss into legacy. But as the evening drew to a close, Tommy played one final piece, song of the soul, the melody that had started it all. But now it wasn't a song of longing or loss, it was a celebration of finding home, of family chosen and given, of love that transcended blood and circumstance. In that moment, as the music filled the room, they all felt it, Emily and Grace's presence, their wisdom, their love, their gift of bringing these broken pieces together to create something beautiful. The music played on, a testament to the power of love to heal, of grace to redeem, and of harmony to make a family whole. As this story touched your heart, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. What moments moved you the most? Which character's journey resonated with your own experiences? Your perspective adds another note to this symphony of human connection. If our stories bring value to your day, please consider subscribing to join our community of storytellers and dreamers. Every subscription helps us continue creating meaningful narratives that celebrate the human spirit. Share this story with loved ones who might find comfort, inspiration, or hope in its message. Together, we can spread the healing power of storytelling. Your likes and support keep our creative flame burning bright. Thank you for being part of our journey.